Okay, thank you. Good morning. Today is Thursday, January 12th, 2023. It's 9 a.m. and this is a meeting of the Senate Natural Resources and Energy Committee. We're meeting this morning with members of the administration, in particular with the Agency of Natural Resources. So we have a lot of guests in the room. Good morning, Secretary Moore. Thank you for coming with your full team. So. And just for those watching, we're basically, although it will be fluid where the rates actually land, we're spending the morning with Agency of Natural Resources and broad brush, 3 different sections. The first is our usual administration introduction, so that everyone on the committee or anyone watching knows the scope of work that ANR is on. The second hour or so, we're going to be looking at the ANR has been leading on areas related to helping Vermont meet its energy goals and greenhouse gas emission reduction targets. So we'll be reviewing plans around transportation, thermal, and agriculture, which are our top 3 sources of emissions. And then we'll close out with, because we're working on the Affordable Heat Act, and there was a bill of a similar nature last year that was vetoed by the governor. We really genuinely understand the concerns that were expressed then, so we really know why that bill was objectionable to the governor. And we've made many changes to that in terms of introducing S5, the Affordable Heat Act. So we're trying to make sure that we heard well enough last spring the concerns, and maybe we've addressed them, maybe not, but we would like to understand last year's bill so that it can help us shape this year's bill. And with that, Secretary Moore, the floor is yours as always. You can manage the time as you like. Some people come up, draw up a second chair, make themselves comfortable, and take it away.
Thank you. For the record, Julie Moore, I'm the Secretary of Natural Resources. It's a pleasure to be here this morning and look forward to spending the next hour kind of sharing what I see as the breadth and kind of incredible work done by the agency. We have put together a set of slides that provides a little bit of the organizational structure of the agency, and I'll let each of the commissioners speak to the specifics of their department. So my piece of this will be really the high level agency perspective. And as you might imagine, the Agency of Natural Resources is charged with oversight, management, and stewardship of Vermont's natural environment on behalf of the people who live here now and generations to come. And it's a really important book of work and work that the staff are unbelievably passionate about.
Can I say one quick thing? Sorry to interrupt already. I noticed when I was looking at your presentation last time, it says legislative partner introduction, and I really appreciate the calling us partners, because we realize we pass laws in here. They are blueprints, and they are never the real work itself. We never succeed without you out there doing the work. So we know that. We appreciate what you all do.
Thank you. I appreciate that. The Agency of Natural Resources is broken into 3 departments and then a secretary's office. So you'll hear from Annie Fitzko, who is our interim commissioner of Forests and Parks, from John Gillen and John Schmelzer, who are the commissioner and deputy commissioner, respectively, in the Department of Environmental Conservation, and then Chris Herrick, who's the commissioner of Fish and Wildlife. Also with me this morning is Maggie Gendron, who is the deputy secretary and works out of the secretary's office as well. The Secretary's office over the last year has undergone quite a bit of restructuring, and that's reflected in the organizational chart that's included in your packet. As you may recall, last session, the budget proposal included the creation of a climate action office within the Agency of Natural Resources. And that climate action office is in the Secretary's office. That's really serving as an intergovernmental hub for coordinating our work. Prior to the creation of the climate action office, certainly there was climate action being taken in various agencies of state government, from work around electric vehicles being led by the Agency of Transportation and Agency of Commerce and Community Development, weatherization programs that were being delivered by the Department of Public Service, as well as the Office of Economic Opportunity and the Department of Children and Families, work by VEM, Vermont Emergency Management, to implement the state's hazard mitigation plan. But what's been lacking is sort of this coordinated center to both understand what each of these different activities are, and then be able to bring information on them together, data and information on them together, to actually be able to assess and track progress and decide if changes or expansions are needed. And the creation of the Climate Office will allow us to get to that point.
We have Municipal Georgia coming in next week.
Correct. And I believe yesterday you may have received the annual update of the activities of the Vermont Climate Council, a brief report that you can speak to certainly in more detail next week. Beyond that, we also have expanded in the environmental justice footprint in the Secretary's office. Prior to passage of Act 154 last session, we had a single environmental justice and civil rights coordinator in the Secretary's office, Carla Ramundi, and she is really good spending her time. She's been on staff now for just about 2 years, and her focus has been civil rights compliance, that we were fairly significantly behind in some of our obligations under that federal law, in particular around language access. And so she has put a great deal of effort into developing a language access plan for the agency, which I signed last week, and we're thrilled to move forward with implementing that. Act 154 did provide for 2 environmental justice coordinator positions that Carla is now in the process of hiring, and really will be shifting her focus to Act 154. From a leadership team level, Maggie has been running point for the agency on that. So if you have questions this morning about our EJ work or going forward, Maggie is absolutely the right point of contact. As I flagged for you, Senator Bray, there are some challenges around the funding for the environmental justice work. We did receive a $750,000 appropriation as part of the FY23 budget. Unfortunately, it was all one-time money, and that includes money that was allocated for staff. We did receive support from the Department of Human Resources in moving forward with those 2 coordinator positions as limited service positions, but we know that this work is ongoing. And so are looking forward to working with the legislature this session to understand what the intention was. I think it may have just been a gap in how the budget ended up on paper, and address the long-term funding needs of this environmental justice work.
I mean, that bill left this committee with substantially more money than it left appropriations with.
Yes.
And, that reflects our belief that we should never be asking you to take our work if you're not adequately supported. And again, your success is our success. We have to partner on that so to get support. And the risk from my point of view is that it looks, besides bad optics, it's just dysfunctional to make requests without sufficient support. So I know we talked about it a little bit over the summer and fall, and I've talked to Senator Kitchell about it. It seems unacceptable to me that we would hamstring where we with that is steady, so you can hire folks.
Thank you. It will be important to the long-term success of this work for sure. Also underway as part of our EJ efforts is the Interagency Coordinating Committee, as well as the establishing the Environmental Justice Advisory Council. Maggie has been helping set those up. The Interagency Committee has held its first meeting at this point, and it has representatives from 11 different agencies of state government participating. And then the Advisory Council, we've received, I believe at this point, the full slate of names.
We're waiting on 4 from the House.
Okay. So we are close to having a full slate of names and look forward to convening that body as well. And the Office of Racial Equity serves as sort of a bridge between those 2 bodies, and will be participating in both on behalf of the state. We also did a little bit of reorganizing just of our own staff in addition to sort of these additional program areas within the central office this year. And that was the creation of a chief operations position. We previously had a director of finance and a deputy director of finance, and kind of looked at the needs both of the secretary's office, but more importantly, the agency, and determined that this operations position was really a priority for us at this point. We have undergone significant transition, and I don't think we're alone in our business offices over the last year, and discovered that there was not as much similarity as I would have expected maybe between the business processes in our three offices. It meant we had a hard time sort of backfilling for one another and supporting one another during these transitions, which kind of piqued and finalized my interest in creating a chief operating officer position that can help with trying to make sure that our processes and workflows are a little bit more standardized across the agency. The other couple pieces of work that she's focused on is we're obviously in this transition period from what we are full telework to some more hybrid future. The agency is moving forward with a hotel desk sort of approach, and need somebody who can think through all the logistics of that. And then finally, as you may know, ANR also has 5 regional offices in addition to the significant number of staff located at National Life. And sometimes those offices, I think, feel like they've been a bit forgotten and left behind. And so having somebody whose roles and responsibilities includes that oversight of our regional offices and making sure they have the services they need is also part of the COO role.
Clarification, I don't understand the metaphor, the hotel desk.
Oh, sure. So what we have, what I think of is a very broad telework policy, very flexible telework policy. And what we have said to staff is if you are going to be in the office 3 or more days a week, you will have a permanent dedicated desk. If you are not going to be in the office, if you're going to be in the office less than 3 days a week, you need to sign out a desk on the day you show up.
Okay.
So you'll no longer have a desk that you're guaranteed to have. It's requiring people to sort of clean off some of their things, organize their files and put them away. The other piece of this is, and I'll get to this in a minute, through the federal funding, we had come to the Joint Fiscal Committee this summer with what we would call the big ask. We added more than 40 limited service positions to support our implementation of these significant federal funds. We don't have 40 empty desks. I mean, we do, because on any given day, there's only about a third of the staff in the building. But we don't have dedicated desks that we can provide to those staff. So something has to change, and this is our approach to managing that.
So when you were last with the committee, and one of those you just mentioned, one of the big challenges was hiring enough staff to help administer all the funds that are flowing into Vermont or already started. So
Correct.
ARPA, there's IIJA, there's IRA money coming.
Yeah.
It's a complicated set of flows. Were you able to find enough people to handle all the grant making and all the rest?
Not yet, but we are aggressively working on it. That's actually a nice transition to the next slide, where that is one of our areas of emphasis for the coming fiscal year, or for the current and coming year. I would say we have had greater success in recruiting for the technical positions within the agency, and it's much more challenging to find grant and contract administrators. And I think that's a reflection of the fact that people who are coming to the agency to do technical work are really there for the mission of the agency. And while there may be some people who have a background in business and finance and are interested in the grants and contracts work, that's work that could be done almost anywhere across the Vermont economy. And frankly, there are places that pay significantly better than state government. And so if you don't have that mission connection, and I know that that's true, ACCD in their housing space has hired several people. And when it's project developers, they have multiple applicants for every opportunity, and are facing the same challenges we are when it comes to business office functions. We've taken some steps. We went through and did some reclassification of our recruitment notices or minimum qualifications with the hope we might get a broader, more diverse set of applicants. We've been looking at different places to post it. But it is challenging, and I know we're not alone in those challenges. Just quickly touching on a few of what I see as the highlights from the work of the agency at this current point in time. I'd mentioned establishing the Climate Office and the Environmental Justice Unit. The funding is a big one. We are anticipating nearly $600 million of additional federal funding that will pass through the agency from the current fiscal year through FY27. It's about $200 million worth of ARPA funds and $400 million worth of bipartisan infrastructure law or IIJA funds. So that's an enormous increase. We'll get to it in a moment, but the agency's budget when I started in this role 6 years ago was about $125 million a year. So with all of this additional federal funds, our budget is now more than doubled. It felt like a big ask to ask for 40 staff, and that's in addition to some earlier requests we've made, but the fact of the matter is we've doubled our budget and had about only a 10% increase in our staff. So it's a lot of work. We're managing through it, and there's some really intense deadlines associated with it. Another piece of work we're engaged in right now is I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with the governor's 10-point public safety executive order that was released earlier this year. Commissioner Herrick may be able to speak to this in a bit more detail, but the warden service within ANR is a law enforcement organization and is participating in those conversations to figure out how we can sort of help support VSP as they're making some transitions. Our roles have been related to taking on responsibilities for animal cruelty investigations, and then also we'll be picking up patrols in state parks as a sister department when those parks are open in the summer. And the last thing I would flag is we recently completed a fairly significant park price increase. We worked with DFR, the Department of Financial Regulation, to do a benchmarking study looking at park prices sort of around the region. Discovered we were woefully undercharging out-of-state guests to our parks as compared to the price Vermonters were paying in visiting parks in other states. And by sort of truing that up, we're able to generate about $1.5 million a year in new revenue. This comes at a really important time because we had to raise the starting salary for our park attendants by about $2 an hour last summer in order to be competitive. We were not seeing the level of applications we typically do, and so sought this wage increase. And that will consume the majority of the new revenue we anticipate generating through this change in the pricing structure.
Senator McDonald and I serve on LPARs, so we saw the rule come through. And there was some discussion as to whether or not we might see a fee bill more generally that from ANR, maybe other areas as well, based on the notion just as the parks needed to be supported by increased revenues. I'm wondering if your fee-based work is adequately supported by the current fees, or though we should anticipate seeing a fee bill that's.
So that's a complicated, not the fee bill question, will you see a fee bill? I believe the answer is no, or at least not relative to this agency. But the question of our fees sufficient to support the work of the agency is a complicated one. And I can put a pin in that, we'll get to it in a couple of slides. But it really is because we don't have programs that are solely fee-based by and large, with maybe the exception of state parks. It's a complicated mix of special funds, but also general funds and federal funds that comprise our funding picture. And so it's how you balance across that funding portfolio.
Sure.
Just highlighting a few areas of emphasis, our attention on the investment of these federal funds is high. We meet weekly to ensure that we're getting these dollars out the door, in large part because the timelines associated with them are really tight. The ARPA money needs to be in projects by the end of next calendar year. And we have endeavored to do some two-step projects where there's a planning and assessment component before the implementation component. And so 2 to 3 years time is really aggressive when you're talking about wastewater and drinking water projects. We also continue to pursue strategic land conservation opportunities. I believe over the last year have conserved several hundred acres and are also eyeing a really significant increase in funding for the Forest Legacy Program. That's part of the bipartisan infrastructure law, $700 million nationwide. But Vermont has been a significant beneficiary of that program in the last over the last decade or more in conserving large tracts of forest lands. Clean water work continues to be a big piece of our budget. The clean water budget that the board recommended to the governor was just about $50 million this year. We have benefited from a really high level of property transfer and consequently property transfer tax, which is one of the 3 funding sources for clean water work in the agency, as well as the unclaimed bottle deposits and 6 points from the rooms and meals tax. That's coupled with $10 million in ARPA funding and a $10 million ask in the capital bill. So that work continues to move apace and anticipate, and certainly Commissioner Beeling can speak to the annual Clean Water Initiative report will be delivered to this body in the next week or so here as well. Outdoor recreation is obviously continues to be a growth area. I think most notably for rural communities statewide, and through the General Assembly's commitment of 2 different tranches of $5 million each for community recreation grants. We've seen a high level of interest in this space and continue our work around developing best management practices for some of these trail-based systems. And then finally, emerging contaminants, PCBs, particularly the PCB testing initiative in schools. While PCBs aren't necessarily an emerging contaminant, our evaluation of them is really cutting edge. We're the first state in the country to go through this comprehensive indoor air testing program. And happy to talk about lessons learned as well as the ongoing work to address PFAS contamination statewide. Lastly, just want to spend a couple of minutes on the agency's budget. What you have in front of you is the FY23 numbers. Obviously, the governor's budget will drop next Friday following his budget address, but it does give a sense for our work. As I indicated when I started, we were at about $125 million a year. We're now up close to $190 million a year, and that does not include the $105 million worth of ARPA appropriations that the agency was directed as part of the FY23 budget. So we really are approaching that $300 million mark. The agency has 600 full-time staff. Not noted here are those 60 or so limited service positions that we've created to support this work, as well as the 400 seasonal workers we bring on every summer to support operation of the 55 state parks. Here's where I start to speak to sort of the makeup of our funds. About 80% of the agency's budget is either special funds or federal funds, with that balance 20% being general funds. And that mix is very different from department to department, but also from division to division within the agency. And so there isn't a simple, straightforward answer to the question you asked, Senator Gray. The budget we prepared last year, as well as the one we proposed this year, does fully utilize what's available to us in terms of special and federal funds, but it is challenging in this era of inflation for those to keep pace with the upward pressures and costs we're seeing.
When your work involves infrastructure investments like in the clean water side, what kind of inflation have you seen in the last year roughly in terms of construction?
I don't know. We could get you some information on that. I know that we've had a number of projects that have gone out to bid where the bids have significantly exceeded the engineer's estimate of probable cost to the point where the contingencies that were included in the budgets were insufficient to fund the projects.
This made me wonder if you've had to sort of pull back the scope of the portfolio of work because the costs are so much higher than you just can't get as much done as originally proposed.
There is some of that, and it's challenging if municipalities have gone out for a bond vote and the ceiling of the bond vote is below the total project cost. So we have had a number of very challenging projects. I think most of them have been able to be addressed through kind of redesign efforts after the bids were open and value engineering. But there have been a couple that have stalled out as a result of dramatic increases in costs. And it's not limited to municipalities. I think Commissioner Herrick has had several hatchery-related projects that have also struggled under that same set of circumstances.
And you know, at the very end of last session, there was funding for helping people who were lacked either potable water or septic system, working functional septic for homes. It's emergency funding, really. If you could just say, this is sort of a near and dear to my heart project, so just like to check in and see how that's gone, and if you're anticipating asking for another tranche of money to continue that effort, because it seemed like the list of people eligible exceeded the funding.
It did dramatically, and then thanks to your efforts, the legislature significantly increased funding. That said, demand continues to exceed supply. This is what we call our Healthy Homes Initiative. We are using ARPA dollars to do this work in large part because most of our federal funding sources don't lend themselves to being directed to individual private property owners. And based on income qualifications, we have put out an open solicitation and asked Vermonters who may be low income and have a failed or failing well or septic system to complete a brief application with the agency. Initially, I think we had anticipated about 200 applications. In the first round, we received more than 1,200 applications. We have since opened this to a second round of potential applications. It's open currently and will close at the end of this month, and we've had hundreds of additional applications. In the first year, we pushed forward over 200 high priority projects, and we prioritized them based on sort of the condition of the current system, and then some of the vulnerabilities of the people who live in the home, in addition to making sure they were qualified economically. So the number of people, as well as the number of elderly and children present in the home. And the stories are just absolutely heartbreaking of people not having basic needs met. We have funding we believe that will ultimately be sufficient to support between 700 and 800 of these replacement projects. Not everyone that applies is eligible. It has to be an owner occupied residence. And then there's this income test are the primary screens. We also have staff visiting each potential recipient just to verify that the system has failed, so that we're sure we're funding the most impactful projects. But it has been an incredible book of work. There's a lot of work yet to come, since we're 200 systems into what we believe will be 700 to 800 we're able to ultimately address. And we are talking about how to have funding on an ongoing basis once these ARPA dollars are exhausted. But we have lots of resources for the next couple of years here to fully deploy it. And there's a companion program that also we put under the Healthy Homes umbrella, working with manufactured housing communities to improve their stormwater, drinking water, wastewater infrastructure.
And so of the 700 to 800 you're anticipating, is that, do you need additional funds to get to that 700 to 800, or that's how much, how far do you think we can go on the funding already?
Correct. That's how far we believe we can go with the ARPA funding that's been directed to the program. And then just my last slide before I will turn it over to Danny shows that, again, that complicated soup of how the ANR budget is funded. That leftmost column is federal funds, so about $56 million in FY23 of federal funds. 34 million of general fund, and then the balance is this myriad of special funds. DEC special funds, the permit fund, parks fund, clean water fund, fish and wildlife fund, which comes from hunting and fishing license sales, some dedicated cleanup funds, and then this sort of also ran box in the lower right-hand corner, which contains more than 40 other special funds that the agency administers. So it's a complicated piece.
Can you just tell us about the petroleum cleanup fund?
Sure. So there is, I will defer maybe to one of you two. I think there's a penny a gallon tax on gasoline and fuel oil sales. And it goes into a dedicated fund to deal with issues when there are spills. So if a fuel company comes and overfills a fuel tank into someone's home and they end up with fuel in their basement, I believe we tap this petroleum cleanup fund to address that, as well as issues at gas stations.
Yeah, it originated to deal with releases from underground storage tanks in those systems. And there's a $10,000 deductible for cleanup, and then there's a cap of, I said 1.1 yesterday, but I checked with the staff, and it's 1.25 million.
And just so that people watching, can you identify yourself?
Yeah, I'm sorry. John Schmelster, I'm the Deputy Commissioner of the Department of Environmental Conservation.
Thank you.
If I'm not mistaken, the petroleum cleanup fund also deals just with flawed tanks. You don't actually have to have a spill.
That's correct.
If the tank has to be repaired.
Yeah, or part of the system. It could be like the pump. If the pump fails too, that's part of the system as well.
And this is a system that the regulated community likes, right? The petroleum handlers
I
like.
think so, because I think it's
Provides the protection.
right. It's been extended, the petroleum cleanup fund for years. I think it started in the late 80s, early 90s.
And it's sort of an effective insurance policy from their perspective.
It works.
Why does the industry like?
I think because it functions like an insurance policy, right? So that everybody's paying in a little bit all of the time, but then there are significant resources available should an incident occur, as opposed to having to raise those resources on a project by project basis.
It pulls the risk.
That's it. Thank you. That's a better way to say it.
Thank you.
With that, I'm happy to turn it over to Danny to talk about it. Yeah. You're all words.
I know we're pressed for time. We're going to be dealing with forest parks in a few minutes, but since you're the, I would hope that A&R would take another look at the Boy Scout camp at Sunset Lake.
Sure. I'm happy to talk with you offline about that, but just so folks are aware, the agency was approached by the Boy Scouts of America regarding their Camp Sunrise, which is on sort of the intersection of Sunset and Sunrise Lake in Orwell and Benson. Am I s-
You know more than that.
It's on the town line.
I know last time I said it out loud, I only got one town of the two right. It's why I was questioning myself. And it's a really fantastic property. It's also a really expensive property. And that was our challenge in reviewing it. I think the Boy Scouts agreed to sell it to us for the appraised value, which I understand to be about $1.5 million. There's also a dam associated with it that our team evaluated, and it indicated it needed to be replaced at a cost of about $500,000. And there's significant capital investment that would be required in order to bring that up to snuff to actually function as a state park, which I think was the vision, to the tune of another $1 or $2 million. And our challenge is we have 55 other state parks with lots of infrastructure needs that we're sort of really stretched to address at this point, and it didn't seem like it was in the collective best interest of the system to take on an additional liability, given where we're at.
I understand that that's the agency's position. My sense is once it's gone, it's gone. You don't have to put it up to it right away. Hold on to it as an asset for its potential future use.
Understand.
There are a lot of interested parties in the area, and I've talked with folks down there. I think one thing that would be helpful is if the towns make a commitment to carrying the ongoing costs of management. So aspect, it's not just purchase or fixes, it's there's an ongoing cost. Good morning.
Good morning. For the record, my name is Danielle. You can call me Danny. I am the interim commissioner for the Department of Forest Parks and Recreation. For some background, I've been with FPR for 20 years. Spent 15 years as the program manager for the Urban and Community Partnership Program, and then most recently as the director of forests. As you can imagine, for FPR, this is quite a transition for us. Former Commissioner Snyder was serving for 12 years. So I'm on week 2 right now, so I've got maybe a pinky toe under me right now, but really happy to be here and work with you going forward. So we are FPR. We're fortunate that the name of the department really fits what we do. We are forests, and we work hard to keep forests healthy, intact, and sustainably managed. We are Vermont State Parks. This past year brought in over 1.1 million visitors to our parks, and that's just during the operating season. If we think about all the other times when they're not operating, I think that number would be pretty staggering. And we are outdoor recreation, and so think about the diversification and increased demand for outdoor recreation. Go to the next slide. This is our core team at FPR. This is the management team. I just want to call note to the executive assistant, Caroline Zeilinga. She is our point person for any of your needs. She helps keep us on point and going forward. So please work with her. And then after that, it's pretty simple. We have 3 program areas: forests, and you can see that I still play a role there as director of forests. We have state parks, and that's led by Nate McKean as director. And we have lands administration and recreation, and Becca Washburn is the director of that team. And then we have our business office, which I think for most of our departments is like the heartbeat that keeps us all going. We have 2 names there: Agnes Barcelow. She's now our operations manager. I recognize her. Yeah. You wouldn't forget her, so she's awesome. That's a great new position for us, similar to the center office. We need someone to be looking over all the operations within the department. And then Angie Bloomer is our financial manager. And then this core team really works to support 130 staff across the state, working in a variety of program areas, mainly in 5 district offices across the state. And then we balloon in the field season. You can imagine the operation of our state parks. We bring on about 400 temporary staff, which is a huge feat just to get everybody onboarded and serving for the season. But I will also share that we bring in a very diverse workforce that's coming in from all over. And many times they come, they fall in love, and they stay. So it's hard, but it's really good work to bring on such a diverse workforce for the summer. Then I just want to touch on some of our programming, and first I'll start with forests. If we think about Vermont, we are so fortunate that about 75% of our land base is forests. And like we like to say that we are forest strong. I can give you all the reasons why forests matter, and it'd probably take me all session to get through that. But that's what our team does, and I think a lot of times we're kind of in the woods under the canopy, and we're not necessarily always recognized for the broad services that we do provide. So I'm just going to go over a few our programs so you kind of get a flavor of the work that we do in the division, because it is the biggest team in the department, but like I said, probably not as much known. The first program area that I'll mention is called Forest Protection, and I bring this up first because it houses our forest health team. And that really is the core of our forestry program, is that healthy forest first. That is our foundation. We actually do annual monitoring. We get up in planes and just trying to have an understanding of what's going on so we can respond. We also have a wildland fire team. It's small. You may not think we have many fires in Vermont, and we don't, but we do have wildland fires, and in the region, we are seeing an increase. So it's important for us to prepare and be able to respond, and we work with fire wardens and local fire departments all across the state. Another program is private lands. Of that 75% of forests, 80% is privately owned. And so our private lands team is really on the front line working with private landowners. The main bulk of the work is supporting the forest land category in the use value appraisal program, where we have 2 million acres of forest land enrolled in that program and 16,000 parcels. So it's a huge body of work, but very important work. We also have a state lands team. In FPR, our state lands team supports all the planning that happens of all A&R lands, and we directly manage 190,000 acres of land. If you can imagine a team that's looking to balance all the uses and users of public land, it's quite demanding and complicated work. Urban and community forestry, this is where my roots are. This team works to green the gray of our developed areas and really works to support municipalities and sort of really maximizing the power of trees downtown. Forest economy. This program supports the forest product sector. Think about foresters, loggers, truckers, sawmill owners, secondary manufacturers. I think again, because we're in the woods and undercover, our forest product sector in Vermont is about $2 billion in economic activity and supports about 13,000 jobs. So it's actually much bigger than the agricultural sector, but I don't think it's as widely known. And then watershed forestry. Really, this program is about when we're doing forestry operations, making sure we're putting practices in to protect water quality. So that's Team Forestry working to keep Vermont forest strong. I'm kind of going fast because I know the time.
Okay, I have a quick question
Sure.
on urban forestry. Do we have a statewide program to help replant trees? And I live in Bristol.
Sure.
Look at older pictures of Bristol. There are many more trees on all the streets, and for various reasons we're losing them. And so I've talked to people there about replanting, but I'm wondering if
We do.
Seems like we have this as a challenge process.
Yeah, we've had a grants program to support communities called the Community Canopy Program for years. And I think we've actually planted some trees in Bristol, but now we're actually getting a huge influx of funds to really elevate that number. We have $1 million in ARPA funds to support urban tree planting for the benefits they provide to water quality. And federal funds right now, we have a watershed moment where $1.6 billion from the Forest Service is going to be supporting urban and community forestry. So we are looking right now at how we design programs to get those funds on the ground in communities. So I would be happy to put you in touch with our program manager, Elise Shadler. I think we just closed out the grant round for this year, but we're going to be having many more opportunities.
Great.
And we provide technical assistance. We'll help you do inventory, pick out the trees, help plant them.
Right,
Yeah.
so, well, I think, let's look forward to coming back to this.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
So our state parks team, hope you've all been to one of our world-class developed state parks, 55 of them across the state, some really fantastic, beautiful places. As I mentioned, we hit a record this year, almost 1.2 million visitors to the parks. This is no small feat to bring in that many people in such a small operating time, and also to run really a business enterprise in state government. I can just tell you that brings its own challenges to do the amount of volume of commodities and purchasing that we do in state government to run the park. So I have a few notes of what our state parks are. They are a gateway to the natural world. I'd say we are probably one of the largest environmental education organizations in the state. We are the third largest owner of built infrastructure for state government with $250 million in infrastructure assets and 2,200 campsites across the state. In order to keep people coming to state parks, you need to keep modernizing them. So we have to continue to invest in state parks, which has a collateral benefit of supporting the trades in Vermont, so it's workforce development. Parks are conserved lands, as we just were talking about, and provide many conservation values. And I just think about all the shorelines that are accessible because of Vermont state parks, people to enjoy. And they provide $100 million in economic benefit to local communities. So really important that we have these gems all across Vermont. And then our last bucket is lands administration and recreation. This team has several buckets of work. One of them is lands administration. This is really an agency-wide service. They help support all the state lands across the agency, Fish and Wildlife, and a small amount in DEC. Think about like all the real estate and the licenses and all that kind of like administrative work they do to support. And we have 360,000 acres that the agency manages. They also, I just think this is so unique for A&R. It's actually really a model of how we actually plan and manage our state lands. We have interdisciplinary teams in each of our 5 districts, and those teams include an ecologist, a water quality expert, fisheries biologist, wildlife biologist, a forester, a recreation specialist, and they get together through all those lenses to figure out the best plan and management for our state land. So it's really unique and something that we're very proud of. This team also leads our land conservation, whether it's going to become part of the state system, but also, as Julie mentioned, we have the Forest Legacy Program, where we support easements on private lands, and we hold 140,000 easements. And then, of course, outdoor recreation. We have, as you know, it's growing, it's diversifying. We have recreation that happens on state lands, but more importantly, it's outward facing, working with local community, working with partners, because most of the recreation trail system is on private lands. And so that's a lot of work to support those teams and sustainable recreation management. They also lead the Vermont Outdoor Recreation Economic Collaborative, or VOREC, which is a Governor Scott initiative to support the recreation economy. And then also they're big grant makers to communities, between $3 and $8 million a year, to support those associations that are the backbone to recreation and to communities to help build those.
Question on trails, especially bike trails, which have come with a little controversy. So we have BMPs for logging and all that. Have we developed BMPs now for bike trails? Do we have a?
Well, there's certainly BMPs available. There's national ones, and we have some guidelines, but that is something that's in the works right now with the Vermont Trails and Greenways Council, which is a group of partner organizations that helps to support FPR. And that is a primary focus, that we can develop standardized BMPs for all trail types across the state. But we do have guidelines that we do provide, that we certainly on state lands they must meet. And if we're granting out money, they'll need to meet those BMPs as well.
Great. It's great that we're growing that those opportunities in the economy. It's come with growing pains, and so it's glad to hear that BMPs, which will have maybe help us anticipate and eliminate some of the challenges in the works. Do you know when you anticipate?
Well, we're eager to, I think it's a primary, if we look at the Trails and Greenways Council with our support, it is a primary action item. And I would say we'd like to see some advancement over I don't know when, but I would think that it's active right now. So hopefully within a year, maybe we'd see something, or at least we actually have some draft material available, so it's not starting from scratch.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
I will just share too that this year we are working on the statewide, it's called SCORP, State Comprehensive Outdoor Recreation Plan, which is a 5-year plan that will think about the vision and actions needed to support outdoor recreation. So that's a great opportunity to really be thinking about where we want to go in Vermont with recreation. So that's our teams across the department. I'll quickly go over our budget. We have about $32 million in FY23. Most of, as you can see, is in salaries that really supports the team providing the service. We do have some contracts and operations. That's really mostly supporting the work in our state lands, particularly a lot in parks to keep them modernized. And then we provide some grants out. Our budget's about 30% general funds, 20% federal funds, a lot of it from the Forest Service and National Park Service. I know in the Division of Forest, we go after competitive funds all the time. And then 42% is in park special funds. And I'll just say 75% of the parks budget is through revenue that's generated through the parks. Think about gate receipts, park services, concession stands, boat rentals. I will also say, you mentioned this inflation. I had a conversation with Nate McKean the other day, our parks director, and he said they're seeing about 40% increase in inflation for commodity purchases and contracting. So that does shift sort of our ability to reinvest because it's costing so much more. And I think I have one more slide that kind of gives you some current are we okay? Should I maybe stop it because of time?
Well, I'm thinking, yeah, I'm mindful of the clock, so maybe pick a highlight or two and we'll.
Okay,
A
I
little more up tempo, not up tempo. Just, well, we might have to be a little more selective about what we hear from each operating area.
yeah, sorry, I took more time.
That's okay.
I'll just tell you one thing, 2024 is Vermont's 100-year birthday, so get ready to celebrate with us in 2024.
State parks.
State park.
What did I say?
Wait, you said Vermont.
He said Vermont.
Oh, no, State Park, sorry. Thank you, I'm sorry.
Senator White.
Thank you, Chairman Bright. Thank you for the park passes that you give to us as elected leaders. I got to take advantage of it in the many Windsor County parks.
That's awesome. Glad you can get out and enjoy.
Are we gonna have another visit because in the interest of time, I'll hold off on some of my questions.
Yeah, so we're really, at this point, just doing introductions, and for
Okay.
topics, we'll invite people back in and have deeper conversations.
When you're back, I'm gonna ask about ash, how they.
Oh, Emerald Ash Borer?
And resilient elms, which I understand are
Yes,
thought of to replace.
we do have some, I'm happy to talk to you about this.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks so much.
Good morning.
Good morning, Mr. Beal.
My name is John Bealing. I'm the Commissioner of the Department of Environmental Conservation. I've been in this role. I started as an interim commissioner in April, and I was appointed permanently in July. Prior to that, I was the general counsel for the department and had some dealings with Senator Bray in that role. But it's an honor to be here, a pleasure to be here. I want to introduce my deputy commissioner, John Schmelzer. I've worked with John for many years. John's background is in responding to hazardous releases of hazardous materials. He was instrumental in the response to the Bennington PFAS crisis. We're going to be doing a lot of things in that space during my tenure. So I thought it would be very helpful to have John on board with me. We've got our mission statement up there. I got it here, so I don't have to crane my neck. I was in the house yesterday. I was doing this the whole time, so it's a little awkward. I think that the thing to really stress about the mission is really kind of the last line. Future generations. I mean, what we do, obviously it has immediate impacts on people, but a lot of what we do has long tail impacts. We really have to think ahead beyond my kids, my grandkids, into the future. That's really what we're trying to do here. We're trying to set this up so this state can remain as beautiful and as pollution-free as we can possibly make it going forward. That's just an important part of our mission. If you want to go ahead to the org chart, I'll just give you kind of a brief overview. So you can see the commissioner's office, there's three of us, myself, John Schmelzer, and John McKelvey. So if you call, ask for John, you'll be all set. We're
When in doubt, ask for John.
just ask for anything. You'll get some. One of us.
We want to keep it simple.
We want to. So, there are 8 divisions. There's really 5 of them on media divisions. So the non-media divisions are administration and innovation. That's really our business office. That is the engine that drives the department. They are unheralded, unsung, and they do incredible work. And especially with this influx of federal funding, they are extremely busy. And as Julie mentioned, it is difficult to fill those positions. That's an area where there's a great deal of competition in the private sector, and we just can't pay as much as they do. So it's really hard to get good people. We're really lucky to have the people we have, but it's an ongoing challenge just to fill those jobs. We can get technical folks, people want to do this work, but when you're doing that kind of work, it's just really hard to recruit and maintain and keep people. The other non-media divisions are environmental compliance. They're really split in 2. So part of what they do is enforcement. They have environmental enforcement officers. They respond to both citizen complaints and also they'll investigate violations that are reported to them by the programs, and they'll build enforcement cases. The other half of that office is environmental assistance. As the name would suggest, we have a lot of complex rules, in this state of statutes, and it can be hard for the regulated community to keep up. And so we try to help folks understand how to comply. And so we don't have to go to enforcement. We don't like enforcement. Enforcement is hard work for everyone. It's not pleasant. It's much better if you can teach people how to comply. And that's what we've been trying to do. The other, Secretary Moore had also mentioned the Healthy Homes Initiative. The Environmental Assistance Office is the lead on that effort in getting these resources to both individuals and the manufactured housing communities. The last one is the state geologist, the Geologic Survey. He happens to reside within DEC, but that group does work for virtually every, well, not every, but many agencies rely on the state geologist. They do a lot of things having to do with aquifers. You know, they were integrally involved with the response in Bennington, trying to figure out, you know, which pathways water's going. They'll do a lot of work on landslides. Landslides are a pretty significant issue in Vermont, and they really try to help folks understand, you know, where not to build, you know, or if they've already built, like, what do you do? So they're a very busy and very vital office, and I really, I feel like that's another outfit that people don't recognize how much work they do. They do a great deal of work. Air quality and climate, as Secretary Moore mentioned, climate has really migrated to the ANR central office. So it really probably should be called the Air Quality Division, although much of what they do, you know, is going to have an impact on climate. They regulate mobile and stationary sources of air pollution. Lots of air pollution are also greenhouse gases. So it has that impact, but the central office is focusing more on the holistic climate issues. This is more specific. We try to, you know, eliminate or get as few gas-powered vehicles on the road as we can. Try to work with folks and other types of heating sources, things to try to move away from fossil fuels. Drinking and groundwater. This is really the on-site. So this is like septic systems on-site. Public drinking water systems. We don't regulate private wells. We regulate public drinking water systems. So they're very involved with all manner of issues having to do with water supply, including contamination, but it can also be naturally occurring. Arsenic is a big problem in Vermont. We just have a lot of naturally occurring arsenic. So a lot of what they do is just make sure people have safe drinking water. Waste management, it's actually waste management prevention, which is kind of key because that just like compliance assistance is good, preventing pollution is much better than responding to pollution. So we have a lot of initiatives driven towards kind of keep things out of landfills, keeping things from being disposed of. But when they are disposed of, and there is a release, there is some kind of public health or environmental issue, the waste management division deals with it. We either have the person responsible clean it up, we clean it up, we manage the cleanup, we make sure it's safe, and we get to the point where there's no unwarranted exposures to contamination. Water investment, it was fairly prescient. I think this division was set up right before I started with DEC, and it really kind of spun out of the watershed management division. It's really just devoted to getting in money and spending it on projects. And I'm really glad they're here now because we have so much of this money. So they're extremely busy. The director, Neil Kamen, has been doing this for quite some time. He's very adept. He understands the federal side of things, the state side of things, and they're doing a great job moving this money. As the secretary pointed out, there's a fairly tight deadline for ARPA, so we really have to focus in on that. And then there's all this bill money coming in. So it's a challenge, but it's a challenge that we're meeting, and it's very exciting. I mean, one thing, just Secretary Moore mentioned just the sheer numbers, the 600 million, which is pretty staggering. But one of the members of that division, Eric Black, who's been around a long time, he went back and did some math, and he calculated that in the next 5 years, Vermont will get more federal water infrastructure funding than we have got, $70 million more than we've got since 1957 combined.
Wow.
Just to give you a sense of scale. So I mean, it's an enormous influx of resources into the state, and really, really well, it's needed and necessary. Finally, I'll just mention watershed management. That is our biggest division. They manage, lakes, ponds, rivers, wetlands, stormwater runoff, direct discharges into rivers and lakes, things of that nature. Very big division, very busy division. We can go to the next slide just to kind of give you a sense of size of divisions. as you can see, watershed management is pretty significantly the largest. Waste management is right up there, drinking water and groundwater. So these are all the major divisions and the personnel. You'll see that there's a red, one thing that Secretary Moore had mentioned, we needed to add staff to help with the ARPA's funding. So that's showing you kind of increases over the next few years. Just to give you a general sense of scale, the department is generally about 300 personnel, and during this period, we're going to get up to around 350. And then it is going to come back down eventually. If we go to the budget, just again, big picture here, this is where the money goes. The yellow slice, those are grants and loans. We do a lot of work trying to help most municipalities and regional commissions get work done. There's about 30% salary benefits, 16% contracts. That's for folks to help us work out, and then a variety of other sources. The next slide just shows you where the money comes from.
Really quick question.
Yeah, sure.
PCF reimbursements, what's that?
So we were talking about the PCF before the petroleum cleanup fund.
Oh, thank
So when folks apply to the funding, they pay. That's part of our job is to get those monies out there. The next slide is kind of where the money comes from. You'll see a large portion of our funding comes from federal grants, mostly from the EPA. And then you'll see general fund is a interdepartmental. Then permit funds are 10%. As Secretary Moore mentioned, it's very hard to kind of line up permit fees for a lot of our programs with actual expenditures. The fees would be, in some circumstances, pretty astronomical. So you kind of have to mix and match and figure out the best balance for getting our programs working. And then you'll look at, you see that there's about 40% of all these other funds that we had talked about previously. Just if we go to the last one, Chris will have some time here. These are really kind of main focus areas for us. I think everyone here is familiar with PFAS, the forever chemical. It is literally everywhere. We are responding to it. We've already responded to it. We went out, we were charged by the legislature to go out and look at all the public drinking water systems. We did so. A number of them did have PFAS contamination, and we work with them getting treatment in place. One thing worth mentioning on PFAS is the EPA in July issued an interim health advisory for 2 of the compounds. We regulate 5 compounds, and the current regulatory standard is if you add up all 5 compounds, anything 20 parts per trillion or above is subject to regulation. EPA is looking at 2 of those compounds, one that's called PFOA, one is called PFOS, PFOS, and it will likely result in the regulatory standards for those compounds coming down significantly, which will likely eventually lead us to also adjusting our standards. So just to give you a sense, there are a number of public drinking water systems that we've looked at that are below 20 parts per trillion, but above detection limits. A number of those would likely become subject to regulation when this happens. We've kind of been waiting. They did tell us, EPA told us they'd do this by the end of the year. Obviously that didn't happen. We are expecting in the next few months that we're going to have to figure out how to respond to that.
A question on that one, because there's a lot going on. It's a complicated area, and Vermont is pushed, I think, is hard to try to regulate protectively and assertively. What is the detection limit? So we're talking parts per trillion, and we're at 20 in total for the 5. What's a current detection limit? Are we down to like 1 part per trillion, or where are we?
I believe it's 2.
Around 2.
I think 2 is what the
Sometimes you can get a little bit lower, but I think 2 is a good.
Yeah, in terms of having a commercially available lab.
And EPA is talking about parts per. We're going like 3 orders of magnitude smaller.
0.004. Is that PFO, or is that one is 0.004 for one of the compounds, and then 0.02. Yeah, they're going substantially down.
Yeah, it's quadrillion. I didn't even know that there was
It's
a name for that.
Yeah.
That low.
So that'll be, definitely
Yeah.
one we'll want to come back to. I'm not sure how you regulate when it's below a limit of detection.
That's exactly right.
You're right.
And I think, and that's a challenge. But EPA, I mean, just keep in mind, what I was talking about is called the health advisory. That is not a regulatory limit. And so when they set regulatory limits, they look at things like technical feasibility. So their number, what's called a maximum contaminant level, that's a federal standard. Those usually typically would come in above what the health advisory would be. So we'll see what they're gonna say. We've got like a betting pool going here with what it's gonna be, so I don't know anybody really knows.
Senator Watson.
I just want to flag that I would love to chat with you about PFAS and potential remedies for PFAS
Yeah.
through the gasification and what data there is about
Yeah.
breakup of
PFAS through gasification.
Sure.
Do you want to talk about it now?
Yeah, that's
I
great.
want to flag it, let's have
Well,
that.
that actually reminds me, thank you. So I had the slide up there with the division directors. I would recommend that this committee hear from the directors themselves. They'll be able to better answer and bring people in that would really, I could talk, big picture, but once you start getting down, I need my folks. So I would highly recommend media divisions, and I think Deputy Secretary General can give you all the contact information for those folks to ask those kinds of questions.
Mr. Chapman has been a frequent flyer. at this
Yeah.
meeting.
He'll be over. Yeah, he'll be over. There was one year when I never saw him. He was here the whole time. Literally never saw him. I walked by that same year. I was like, oh, yeah. So PCBs, I think folks are all familiar with the Burlington High School situation that led to the legislature requiring us to go out and look at all the schools. We've been doing that. It's been a little frustrating and slow just because of a lot of things. Part of the supply chain, part of it is like everywhere else. It's the great resignation. There's not enough people. So it's taking us longer than we would have liked, but we're getting there. I think we're up to over 10% of schools have been sampled. We've only had a couple that were above what are called school action levels. We're dealing with those. I would say, again, knock wood, so far it hasn't been, no one really knew what going in, what we were going to find. So far there hasn't been anything that blew us away. Burlington High School, those were extremely high levels. I've not seen anything like that. And then just very briefly, I think the secretary has really touched on ARPA and Bill, but obviously a big focal point of our work this year is going to be.
I have a little acronym challenge on that last one. What's BIA?
Oh, it's the bipartisan infrastructure law. Some people also call it IIJA. Bill is just easier to say. I can't say
Yeah,
IIJA.
I can't say that.
Thank you.
So I want to be respectful of Commissioner Eric, if anyone has questions on that.
Well, thanks. So we will, if anyone needs to get a break, please do. We will, and just so we don't have people breathless, we'll go another 2 minutes and then we'll take our break. I knew that this morning there'll be a little sliding schedule just to fit people in. So
We are taking a break.
we're gonna keep going for another 10 minutes.
Okay.
You're welcome.
Okay, I'm gonna.
Yeah, I don't want to be between.
Yeah.
So, yeah, Commissioner Herrick, so
I will be.
if we can do another 10 minutes, then we'll take a break before moving on to topic 2.
The capacity sign off.
Okay.
Good morning. Good morning. For the record, I'm Christopher Herrick. I'm the Commissioner of the Department of Fish and Wildlife. I'm happy and honored to be here representing the department. I've been here before, but just a reminder, I was appointed last year. Previously to that, I was the Deputy Commissioner of the Department of Public Safety. Prior to that, I was the Director of Vermont Emergency Management, Homeland Security. Prior to that, I was the Chief of the State Hazmat Response. And I know that I'll be in here a bunch this year, I presume, Senator. Congratulations, by the way, in your re-election. The department, it's all written up there. I'm not going to read to you, but I will tell you that our mission is pretty simple. It is to hold the wildlife, the flora, the fauna, all the little critters, the plants, up to the game in trust for all Vermonters now and for future generations. That also includes our habitats. And I want to stress the work that we do there when I get into what we do, because everybody's aware Fish and Wildlife is hunting and fishing, but we do so much more, and I want to leave you with that before I'm done today. We can move on to the next slide, please. It's a pretty simple organization. I will have you note Abigail Connolly is the principal assistant. She's a recent addition, and her job is very complex. It is to keep me organized, and so she's underpaid and overworked. But she has been communicating with Jude already, and she will also be working with me on policy development. So when we get into the different divisions, Eric Palmer is the director of the fish division, and that includes our fish culture stations and all the work that they do in stocking the various ponds, streams, and lakes in the state. But also in that division, we manage all the multiple fishing accesses around the state, which is a real part of that's a gem when you look at what we do in the state of Vermont. And just to highlight some of the work that we've been doing there, we're making more and more of them handicapped accessible ADA compliant, so that more and more Vermonters can partake. Moving on to the wildlife division, Mark Scott's the director. Mark has been with the department for 40 years. He is a wildlife biologist and is very skilled in his job. So there's where we manage. The big things are like the deer herd, the moose herd, and as well as developing rules and regulations through our Fish and Wildlife Board. The warded service is we had a retirement over the summer and hired Colonel Justin Stedman, who was previously the major. He is the new colonel. He's fantastic. And while I'm proud of all the divisions there, I do want to highlight what they're doing right now. Secretary Moore mentioned them earlier, and their contribution to the overall public safety initiative. During the deer season, which is a very busy time of year, they don't have a downtime. I've found, in the summer they're out with fishing. Now we're getting into ice fishing. Thankfully, it's getting cold because it's beginning to snow out. And so they're very busy, but they're also though picked up the animal cruelty cases, and I'm sad to report since September we've had roughly 30 reports that required an on-site investigation. These range from dogs to goats, and so while they're extremely busy with their normal work, they pick this up, and what they work in conjunction with the Agency of Agriculture in some cases, as well as the Humane Society. And so it's a good partnership. And then they also are going to be patrolling the parks come summertime. And the other area that they picked up was any hunter involved shooting. They're the primary investigative agency now, not the state police. And that actually makes sense. Since they're incredibly skilled at forensics in the woods. Just a note, we have dogs, tracking dogs, as well as dogs that can identify black powder explosive. And so every significant shooting they've had in Burlington, our dogs have been there working with Burlington PD to recover casings and firearms. It's not advertised, but it's just one more task that they're helping to contribute to the overall effort.
Is Colonel Batchelder retired?
Yes, sir. The outreach division, probably a lot of what you've heard good about the department is because of their hard work. Allie Thomas is fantastic. Here's where we have an app on our phone, and if you don't have your app, I'm going to double check next time you come in. I'm going to inspect your phone for it. It has everything you need to know about Fish and Wildlife, the seasons. You can buy your license online. It's fantastic. But she also oversees our hunter education courses, of which there are many, and they are highly rated. We have a lot of volunteers that have to be wrangled, and they do a good job with that. And they also oversee our conservation camps, which registration opened on Monday, and they're already busy filling those up. Those fill up every year down in Kehoe and up at Buck Lake. Outstanding programs, and very, very proud of the work. And then we have our business office, which pays the bills, counts the beans, does all that hard work, which is pretty significant, even for our particular department, which isn't huge. We have a lot of federal money coming in. I've already explained, I forget that slide there, I apologize. If you want to bounce up to the, yeah. I can do that. I think the takeaway here is,
Up here.
yeah, I know. I'll just go to the second bullet where it talks about some of the federal funds that come in. And here we're talking about Pittman Robertson and Dingle Johnson. And so those are federal funds. The DJ funds are primarily for like recreational fishing. And then the Pittman Robertson funds, they are excise tax on firearms, ammunition, and other hunting supplies and equipment. And that money we use for the purchase and conservation of habitat. And we have added to our WMAs. We've also added to the wetland protection to conservation. And that is one of the things that folks aren't aware that the department does. That is a huge component of our work. And we have folks that work extremely hard on that. Any kind of land transition, got about 1,000 documents that go with it. And so that's something we're very proud of the department. And so I know we're short on time, so I can wrap it up, sir.
Well, so that bullet last time included, the last page included excise tax on gasoline.
Yeah,
It's like a surprise to me. So what's that piece?
It's probably a small amount on the voter. It's not a lot. And I was asked in the House if we anticipated those funds decreasing because people are going to be driving or using gasoline as much. The answer is not yet, because we've actually seen an increase in the purchase of firearms and ammunition, and the taxes on those continue to climb.
We will have a bill in here that I hope has a positive impact for your
I hope so,
operating
too.
area in terms of, we've talked about how people without permits use boat launches and sort of a fair share concept for some sort of fee for people who are using those launches but not using a regular registration.
Happy to discuss. I will wrap up just by telling you that next week you will all get a report that's due, because and I'll kind of wrap this back up how it started. The secretary mentioned the partnership that we have. We had a good partnership last year in developing some legislation. And we had a partnership in the working group in which you participated, Senator, as well as Chair Sheldon, on upgrading and modernizing our trapping regulations. And the recommendations are due to you next week, and they will be here. We're just putting the final touches on the report. But I am proud of the work that the working group did. We brought in disparate groups and work together to try to come up with some common ground.
One other quick follow-up from that work over since we last worked with you in person was there's the rules around coyotes. What's the status on that?
The status of that is on Tuesday night, we had the last meeting of the working group that was put together for that. And at some point, I'll go through the whole process with the working groups and my thought process on how I got there. And so that report is now coming to me with their recommendations. And I hope to have that ready to go to the Fish and Wildlife Board and start that whole process, which is a long process, involves public hearings, as you know, and ICAR and LCAR, hopefully as soon as maybe next month.
In the last piece of work we talked about last year was a conversation about governance outreach, the sort of the outward facing part of the department. So we'll check back in on
Sure.
that one as well.
I will say that the working group is a deliberate effort to respond to those questions from us.
Sure. Senator McCormick.
Not having heard from you on the question, I do not have a position at this point. I'm sure you're aware that some of the wildlife advocates have complained that they did not get to fully participate. That's their claim. And we'll take a look at it. And I will welcome your response.
Absolutely. I will say that everybody was there. Everybody participated.
Mr. McDonald, last question to you.
Just managing the health of wildlife for all Vermonters, and the vehicle that you mentioned was the Fish and Wildlife Board through which these discussions take place. And following up on Senator McCormick's question, thank you last year for trying to wide or open up the discussion to a wider group of people on how to deal with coyotes, hunting coyotes and dogs, and trafficking. But we're getting a lot of pressure that the Fish and Wildlife Board doesn't represent the broad spectrum of Vermonters whose wildlife we're managing. And what advice would you give us to how to broaden that perspective?
Sure, that's a great question, and I appreciate the opportunity. I think it's important first to remember what the scope of the Fish and Wildlife Board is. It is to develop rules and regulations about activities which you have already legalized. Because the hunting activities that they are regulating, help develop these rules, are based on legal hunting. The second part is when we talk about managing wildlife, they have a small sliver of it. The actual management of wildlife in the state of Vermont is done by the scientists and the experts at the Department of Fish and Wildlife. And so I would say that hunting and fishing regulations, while they do speak to wildlife management, they are a small portion of the overall management of wildlife. That is done by wildlife biologists and scientists, and they base their recommendations on a wealth of knowledge and experience.
So we get into how many dogs may be legally permitted to chase a coyote?
None
The
right now.
scientists will,
Oh, none right now.
the scientists will determine this, or?
Well, see, that's where we'll have the board will bring it up, but we'll have public hearings and hear from various people. And that's, and just so you know how the board works, they generally look to me and my staff to make recommendations to them. And I listen to everybody. I think there's nobody in this room who will say that I've not had conversations with all groups. We brought all groups in for these conversations when we were developing the rules. And that is an appropriate place, as is the public hearing space during the board's deliberations.
So I think Commissioner from last year, being a good listener and participating and answering our questions. Hopefully.
I appreciate that,
Yeah,
Senator.
thanks. And obviously we have a lot more to follow up with you on.
Sure,
There's
no, and I look forward to the
multiple irons in the fire,
discussions.
Right. Yeah, I think before we go on a break, I think one challenge with the reconfiguration that some people would like to see of the Fish and Wildlife Board is, from my perspective, is they're looking for a board that's addressing things the Fish and Wildlife Board isn't designed to
Correct.
address. And so I don't know if there's another board, a different board, whatever it is.
So
Reconfiguring the board doesn't quite seem like a good fit for the goals that some people have.
I think that's very insightful of you to make that distinction better than I have to this point, so thank you. And I can work with you on developing a more formal process to hear those voices. But the working group clearly was one of those ways that I said, we need to do this. That wasn't mandated by legislature. That was that came out of my little brain. And I convinced staff that this is the best way to go. And just for I was on DEV for an hour yesterday, and the first caller was complaining that I did that. And I just said, my response, and you go back and listen, is I'm the commissioner for everybody in the state of Vermont. And I will listen to everything. But again, I'm going to take that information, balance it out. When it comes to a scientific decision, that's easy for me. I go to the scientists. When we start getting to more of the social stuff, I think we can look at coming up with a solution that may meet your needs or the need without tinkering with the membership of the Fish and Wildlife Board, because their role is specific. And the example that I often give is we're not putting non-plumbers on the plumbing board for the sake of diversity.
So, yeah, so.
Oh, I should have said that. I could tell already.
I think your answer redoes the question. Okay, I was not the sponsor of the bill last year. That was Senator Campion, but his argument was that the Fish and Wildlife Board had basically the wrong charge. That it was still historically, even though it has called Fish and Wildlife, that historically they were really still de facto the Fish and Game Board. That they were dealing with wildlife only as game, and that it should have a broader view of wildlife. And I know that the main objection was, well, you want amateurs, you don't want experts. Well, experts at Fish and Game is what we have, well, what we call it upon that we politicians should not be dealing with the social issues. And so I think what we may have a different understanding of what the question is. Your answer is very precise and convincing to the question you're trying to answer, but I think it's a different question.
Maybe, but I do think that the role that they have is the right role. And I think you want to leave the broader management of habitat, wildlife, to people like the Mark Scotts and the Eric Palmers and the Kim Royers and the Bertie Penkas, who are on a boat in Lake Champlain pulling fish all summer and dissecting them to do an analysis. These are people who are experts at what they do. They do it every day. We don't want a part-time board managing a much broader area of fish and wildlife management, in my opinion.
Okay, yeah, and I think you and I have correctly identified what the difference is.
You and I are gonna
That's the
have more
discussion.
coffee this
Yes,
session
yeah,
than we did last year.
I enjoy having coffee.
Right, me too.
So, yeah, we'll take a break. I'm gonna put the chair prerogative last word before we stop, and that is this committee has an interest in representing, just as you were saying, the interests of everyone in the state. And so how to bring those forward in the most productive way is a challenge. I think, quote unquote, I hate this term, but non-consumptive users or participants, will work on finding appropriate vehicle to make their voices, perhaps a bigger part of the conversation. But where that conversation is held, how that conversation is held,